we're going to have Robert come, and this morning I was looking through, because what I want to do is I want to get like a version of the Gospel of Thomas where every verse that's in the scriptures in our Bible, I'm going to put like in bold font with the verses where you can find the regular scriptures. So anyway, I've got this. This is a handy book, The Complete Gospels by Robert J. Miller, editor. It's got the 4 Gospels and something. I have my newsletter. I made copies of it yesterday, but we have ancient Jewish Gospels. They have a whole section here. Scholars have determined, I think they got 3. The Gospel of Nazarenes, the Gospel of the Ebionites, and the Gospel of the Hebrews. So the newsletter's been talking about that a little more. You can pray for Kay and the boys. They're having some car trouble and a little short of funds at the end of the month. So pray for them.
Yes.
Joseph and Joyce are out of town. I guess they're visiting her family down in Corpus Christi.
Right.
Next Sabbath, pray for Robert. Are you taking your son with you? It's just a romantic getaway with you and your wife.
We're all going.
Okay. It's a family
So
We're
getaway.
not going to be super romantic.
So much for that.
Quasi-romantic.
Said you were laugh. I got a laugh.
Quasi-romantic getaway, because he's got to take care of his son. They're going. It's on a cruise. Where are you going to?
Going to Roatan, Honduras, and Cozumel,
Wow.
and Costa Mesa.
Have you done this before?
Oh yeah.
That's your first cruise. They're nice. They're not all that expensive, and they're nice. I haven't done one, but friends are showing me. It's really nice. So next Sabbath, Joseph and Joyce are going to be back. I'm going to be back on Army again. They pay. It's like 2 things. I'm obligated to go, and then I get money when I do. So it's the incentive.
When they feel like it, they pay.
Yes. Well, I haven't had trouble getting paid in a while. It has happened. So Joseph and Joyce are going to be doing Sabbath school, and Jonathan is actually going to give his message, and probably Kay and the boys and everybody else will be here. Paul Jackson and all of our regulars hopefully will be here next Sabbath. So I'm going to go get the newsletters, but I'm going to turn it over to Robert, and we're in the 70s, so like I was looking at this. I got the Complete Gospels, the parallels, and it's how they're figuring. It's like 80 of the verses of the Gospel of Thomas are also found in our Bibles.
Yeah, I've been listening to that, and it's all familiar. Yeah.
Right, you have the Agrapha, and there's New Testament Apocrypha Part 1 and 2, which is a good collection. It's kind of older. Part 1 is the life of Yeshua, and then the Part 2 is like the Acts of the Apostles and things like that. And once we finish the Gospel of Thomas, hopefully we can go on to the Epistola Apostolorum and other writings. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Robert. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this presentation by Robert. Speak out.
We're excited. Okay. All right, so let's see. And where we left off last time was I got all the way down to Logian 79. So we'll be beginning at Logian 80. So just a couple of things for any of us that might not have been here the last time or whatever. Basically, this is probably the strongest quote-unquote contender for an actual gospel outside of the 4 canonical gospels that are handed down to us by tradition. Scholars and theologians have more or less written this book off as being inauthentic, but as the doctor mentioned earlier, there's something like 80% of the sayings here have parallels with the canonical gospels, and it's really hard to say definitively that this book has any kind of quote-unquote Gnostic ties or whatever. But what I'm here to try and demonstrate is that really a couple of things. Number one, the Gospel of Thomas is a book of riddles. It says as much about itself at the beginning. It says, first thing, that whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste of death, right? So basically the first riddle is that the tasting of death is associated with not understanding the words of this book. That this book should be understandable if you can find the mystery or the answer to these riddles, or if you're able to understand the interpretation of this book, for example. So the proof would be in the proverbial pudding, I guess, if you were to actually be able to go through here and suss out the meaning and actually find the interpretation and be able to communicate the interpretation. Would at least prove the validity that it is what it says about itself, and that is that it has the ability to bring you to spiritual life, in other words, out of the tasting of death by means of understanding. And again, the reason why people associate this with Gnosticism is the heavy dependence on the concept of understanding, that is through the mind, through the reason, rather than, and this is kind of a questionable assertion, but the idea behind the opposition to Gnosticism, that was an exclusively a head knowledge, wasn't a heart knowledge, that, you know, that a person could understand something, but, you know, that's different from the way the scriptures are presented to us. However, the counter to that is that when you read the New Testament, especially interpretations of the Old Testament that exist within the New Testament, is that the idea that you would see the coming of Yeshua in the Old Testament as spoken of by the Old Testament is generally speaking demonstrated by saying, you know, have you not read the scripture that, or did you not, you know, have you never read that? In other words, it's all based on the writings of the Old Testament. You should understand, right, in your mind and in, you know, your scriptural understanding should bring you to the knowledge that Yeshua is the Messiah that we were all waiting for. And they always bring out verses from the Old Testament to sort of underline and underscore that basic principle. So the idea here is that when Yeshua did come, he also spoke about future things, future revelation. Upon his return, for example, a sword, which we interpret as the scriptures, right, would come out of his mouth, right? You know, so in other words, the symbolism is there, the imagery is there, that there's going to be some kind of teaching that comes out of his mouth in the form of scripture at the time of his return, right? And so that would leave you with basically 3 dispensations. So this is something that's sort of taught in the canonicals, that there would be 3 dispensations, that the Old Testament would have within it the teaching of 3 is kind of demonstrated by, for example, whenever you see 3s of something, like in the Ark of the Covenant, which is a box, basically, if you will, with 3 symbolic items contained within it, right? One of which is the tablets of the law given to Moses. The other is the rod that budded, that was given to Aaron, of course. And then the third item is this golden jar of manna. And this is all explained in the book of Hebrews. And actually, the author of Hebrews, which most people say is Paul, but it could be Barnabas, could be Clement, could be somebody we don't know. It doesn't identify who it is. So we take it on faith based on what it is and the fact that it's, of course, in our canon. But that being said, right about the time he goes into this, he basically kind of opts out and says, well, which we can't go into particulars right now, right? Which leads me to believe anyway, just as somebody who's trying to read this, that he doesn't really want to give away the ending, right? Because this is something that comes in time through insight. Because when you break it down, remember on the last time I was here, we talked about the transfiguration and Moses and Yeshua and Elijah being on the mountain, and correspondingly we had James and Peter and John. And we talked about how John was spoken of as being held back until the time of the end. And in that conversation in the end of the Gospel of John, where, you know, Yeshua asked Peter, he says, do you love me more than these others? And the reason why he would is because he's associated with the church. Upon this rock I will build my church. Which again, the Catholic Church has glommed onto, but it isn't particularly related to them as a church. It just happens to correspond to the truth that Peter is associated with Yeshua, and therefore as symbolic of the Christians, right? So that being said, you have John being spoken of as remaining until the end, so you have him as a future as a symbol of a future congregation that corresponds with Elijah, because Elijah is spoken of as not only having come, but also coming, right? So in other words, when Yeshua identifies himself as him who is, him who was, and him who is to come, there's like a three-part thing. He always was. He was basically, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, or whatever. It was from the beginning, right? Speaking of his coming, his first coming, his coming in the flesh. That is to say, him coming as a human being to live out a human life on this earth in order to somehow bring about a salvation of mankind. That his sacrifice would somehow lead to our salvation. And he spoke of, for example, John coming in the future. He spoke of Elijah coming in the future. In the book of Revelation, he also speaks of whoever overcomes, I will give you to eat of the hidden manna. Right? So if you see that third item, which is in the Ark of the Covenant, or the covenant that's given to us by God, right? That is a future one. So you have a future revelation, or the golden jar of manna is to be given to us, that Elijah is to come, and John is to be held back until the time of the end. Then by process of elimination, that James would correspond to Moses, and he would correspond to the tables of the law. You know what I'm saying? And so there would be 3 revelations and 3 congregations. And that's even borne out by the fact that Peter, not knowing what he was saying, is he said, should I build 3 tabernacles here for you? One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, right? As if to say those are 3 congregations, right? But not even realizing it, because we only know of the 2 so far. We have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament, right? So what would be the basis for accepting any further scriptures? What would be the basis for us to utilize the sword, if you will, that is to come, that's coming at the end of time, that is spoken of by Yeshua himself, right? So the idea is there's got to be some kind of mechanism, and we spoke again last time about how one example of this exists in the book of Jude, where Enoch, the book of Enoch, is quoted by title, so you're given the title, is spoken of as saying that he is the 7th from Adam, so he's given his antiquity, right? And that he prophesied. That gives him the status of a prophet, or gives that book, in other words, the status of prophecy, right? That it prophesied to the people who were entering the church, that took it out of the antediluvian age and to the Christian age, and specifically to the time of his coming, because the verse actually says, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints. So that expands the scope of the book of Enoch out of antediluvian times to bear on the time of his coming. And one of the first things it says in the book of Enoch, if you read it, because he's read all the way down to Enoch 1:9, obviously because he's quoting it. So clearly he's read Enoch 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1. What is the thing that Enoch says about it itself? Is that it is not for his generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come. Which basically implies that it's not going to be in the scriptures until that time. You see what I'm saying? And that Jude exists as a basis that you can use, because you might as well be saying, look, I'm giving you the title of the book, I'm giving you its antiquity, I'm telling you its prophecy, I'm telling you it bears on the people creeping into the church, and that it's going to be valid at the time of his coming. I mean, he might as well be saying that because it's structured that way. And so this is a literary argument. It's something that exists within the scriptures. That a person could say, well, I don't accept the scriptures. Okay, fine. But the thing is, if you can read Huckleberry Finn, if you could watch Star Wars, if you could read, any kind of literature and just read it as literature, what is the literary statement? The literary statement is exactly what I've said. The book is ancient, it's prophetic. That's at least Jude's opinion. Whether you agree with it or not is really beside the point, because it stands as a literary argument that exists within the scriptures. And so a person could stand on that on a purely literary basis. So the idea is that by means of the scriptures, you should be able to suss out what these meanings are.
Yes.
Yeah, well, again, because it's telling you all of these things, it's just because it defies tradition, and because it stands in the face of what we've been taught for 2,000 years, right? And yet it's obvious when you see it, because it's a seeing, it's a recognition, it is a working out of riddles, it is a working out of parables. It's, the fact that, like what I said about Jude, is so obvious when you see it, right, that he might as well be saying that. I mean, if a verse literally existed saying this book that you have is ancient, prophetic, that it bears on my time, that it bears on the time of his coming, if he literally said that, right? Then Christians might believe that, and they might question why that book was left out, for instance. But he literally does say that. I mean, he says that literally. So in other words, he is saying that. And so anybody who contradicts that is basically calling Jude a liar, or misinformed, or something along those lines, which, it's off limits for a Christian to do that. You're not supposed to question Scripture. You're not supposed to second guess the Scripture, so it becomes a problem. Now, a lot of people would counter-argue that, of course, that, my view was corrupted, maybe it's not exactly the same book. He does give us a rather lengthy quote that pretty much line for line, word for word is the same, right? Which should be the same, because why would God make a mistake? You know what I'm saying? Why would he let error creep into the, he's not the author of confusion. You know what I'm saying? So with that basis, without basically being stated, right, where does that leave the church? If, for example, everything that they're founded upon, and this would have been true at the time of the coming of John the Baptist too, because if the pattern was always going to be that there would be 3 revelations, and we only got 2, again, what is the mechanism? What is the thing that gives us the ability to bring this about? Well, again, it means that everything that's based on the two dispensations alone is erroneous, right? Because it's all understood from the inside out, not from the outside in. Authorities have said these books are in and these books are out. And what is manifestly obvious about that is there's different canons for different churches in different places in different times throughout Christian history. So there really is no definitive canon. The Bible itself doesn't say these books are in, those books are out. You would think if that were important somehow or other, you would be some way to discern that. But it doesn't exist. So it's something that human beings have taught because out of consensus, right? But there is objective reality and there is subjective reality. There is the objective and there is the consensus. And a person who joins this church and accepts these books does so by consensus, right? But if there was a way out of it, right, it would have to exist within
Error by consensus.
All right. So that being said, it means that the teachings are fundamentally flawed. Not the scriptures, mind you, but the teachings are fundamentally flawed because they're based on a false concept that doesn't exist and is in fact refuted.
Right.
The fact that you don't accept the Book of Enoch is basically refuted by Jude, right? So in other words, you have what is living and what is dead, right? What is living is the ability to understand the interpretation of these sayings, in other words, right? What is dead is the inability to understand, the lack of eyes to see and ears to hear, because again, because it exists again on a literary basis rather than well, I shouldn't say rather than, but not exclusively upon a literal basis. Like you don't always take Yeshua literally when he says that Lazarus is asleep. He means that he's dead, and he specifically means that. You know what I'm saying? So he's saying that sometimes you got to look at the figurative rather than the literal. So when you go to verse 80 or Logian 80 here, whoever has recognized the world has found a body, but whoever has found a body is superior to the world. Why? Because again, a body is dead, right?
Right.
Okay, so in other words, whoever comes to understand the meaning of these words will not taste of death, rather than, so he's pointing to, obliquely anyway, is the idea is that if you don't understand the words, you're dead. If you do understand the words, you're spiritually alive, right? So if you find that the church exists sort of in a dead state, that the world exists in a world of death because it exists on a basis of consensus, right? Rather than something objective and something that, and the truth is, if you look at it through this lens, all of a sudden this literary stuff becomes very clear, it becomes very obvious, and it becomes very sort of liberating too. Because it does show that all of the teachings of the church can easily be discarded. Like when John the Baptist says that the axe is laid at the roots of the tree, right? The trees have to do with teaching, the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? The idea that the trees have to do with teachings, the fig tree, right? The teaching of the Jews, right? That the axe is laid at that, right? Or elsewhere in the Gospel, Thomas says the grapevine has been planted outside of the Father, but it will be pulled up by the roots. Right? So the idea is, what is the roots of a teaching? If the roots are grounded in the canon, and the canon is grounded in consensus, then it basically means it's man's teachings and is therefore dead. right? So if you come to understand that, then you've overcome, right? Remember, whoever overcomes, I will give to eat of the hidden manna. I will give the morning star. It's all a function of overcoming. So if you see the literary element and you understand these things from the inside out rather than from the outside in, if you understand them intuitively as opposed to doctrinally, right, then you have the basis to stand and you have the ability to see with your spiritual eyes and hear with your spiritual ears, in other words. And so, in other words, so he's basically saying it's a dead teaching, it's a dead end, right? But there is hope, there is a salvation that comes through the understanding. So moving on to 81 then. Let him who has grown rich be king, and he who possesses power renounce it. So there's a whole inversion now. Because you see, the teaching being from the inside out undermines the teaching that's from the outside in. Or the teaching that's from the bottom up, let's say, trumps or overcomes the teaching that's from the top down by means of this understanding. You see, and so the person who has become rich, right? Again, in the Gospel of Thomas, the poverty and the wealth are an ongoing theme. It's a running thing within the Gospel of Thomas. What is wealth? What is poverty? Right? Wealth has to do with the eyes to see, the ears to hear, the knowledge of the kingdom. He went plowing in the field and found a treasure, right? And therefore he became rich, right? Because why? Well, what is the field? It's the ground, right? So what is the ground? It's the earth, right? So out of the earthly teaching, you're able to pull out the heavenly treasure, which is the wealth, right? So if you come to find the wealth, in the same way that the conflict existed between John the Baptist and the power structure that was in his day, the religious establishment that existed within his day, the fact is that he was speaking the truth, they were not. Right? They were wearing the garments. He was wearing, the camel's hair and the leather belt. You know what I'm saying? He stood in stark contrast to them. But who did Yeshua go to?
He was the real priest. They were the fake ones.
Right. And so the entire basis for what is wealth. Who was wealthy in that case? John the Baptist was wealthy because he had the spiritual wealth. He had the spiritual knowledge. And who was poor in that case? Right?
Right.
It was the religious establishment.
One thing that's very interesting, how Yeshua says, he that loses his life for my sake will gain it. And like with the rich young fool, right? What must I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus says, just give all your wealth away. He wasn't willing to do that. And we also see in the epistle of James.
His wealth owned him instead of him owning his wealth.
In the epistle of James, we see this. He's like, you have people coming to church. Oh, there's somebody rich. Oh, let's take this old man. He's poor. Why don't you go to the back and let this, this esteemed rich person come here and sit in the front? And then, James says, what are you doing? You're the one. You're showing favoritism. And then he says, isn't it the wealth and the rich people that are persecuting us, right? Back in the 80s, and I want a prosperous economy. Who doesn't want that? Wants what's best for people. But we've come to a place now where all these corporations have gone all in for wokeism and evil, Marxism. I guess the Marxist system, they get to keep all their money. They just make sure nobody else gets to accumulate wealth. All right, and they want to keep it that way. They want to create a new feudalism. So Scripture warns us about corruption,
any
material.
vestige of freedom or wealth or travel.
What does Jesus say?
Well,
Lay down a treasure on earth and treasure.
The one thing about it, though, and this is another constant refrain throughout all the scriptures, is that this world as it stands is not our world. We are citizens of heaven. We are not citizens of this world.
Just passing.
We're alien to this world if we have the spirit. That friendship with the world is enmity with God. These things are constantly spelled out. Let God be true and every man a liar. Right? All of these things help the person. Right? So, but this is probably the most revolutionary verse in this entire book, because what he's saying is, let him who has grown rich, has found the treasure in the field, has found the secret message hidden under the earthly terminology, in other words, right, be king, right? And again, he's going to, throughout the millennium, right, we are going to be kings and priests.
That's right.
Right? So this is the overthrow of the entire establishment, the entire religious establishment, as well as the secular establishment, because this is a legal contract between God and man, the Bible, right? It is his legal right, because he does everything orderly, he does everything, you know, that he wouldn't, he doesn't cut corners. He doesn't leave, you know, things out. He supplies every need, every answer, everything. You know, just because you don't have it, just because you don't know it, just because you don't know where to look, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You know what I'm saying? It exists outside of your ability to understand it, perhaps, but it's there, right? And it says, but let him who has power renounce it, right? So in other words, and I don't want to name names, but let's say you're high up in the church, you're high up in the religious establishment. If you are the religious establishment, if you are the universities, if you are, you know, the preachers, the teachers, or whatever, what does it tell you to do? Let him who possesses power renounce it. In other words, understand that you're wrong and give place to the people who are right, who have grown rich through this understanding. So this is actually very revolutionary, because this is saying that there's going to be an aversion. There's going to be a taking over. There's no more, you know, I don't want to say no more Mr. Nice Guy or whatever. I'm going to say there's no more ignorance. How are they even going to pass this stuff off once people see it? You know, how are they going to pass this stuff off once people come to realize it? You know, they'll silence it, they'll shut you down, which is what happened at first, mind you. You know, there was more than just because they loved Yeshua. See, the whole thing about this is that from the beginning, if there were people who knew this, because again, for this to be decoded, it was encoded. And this, for all of this stuff to be in the canonical scriptures as well, right? To be able to decode that even, right?
Right.
It means that there were people who knew, because there were people who knew to write that. There were people who knew how to couch that. There were people who knew how to take heavenly concepts and couch them into earthly terminology, so that the person who bought the field, so to speak, could go plowing into it, in other words, studying it, looking into it, right? And not go past Jude 13 and 14 and 15. You know what I'm saying? And not go past those things. Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're probably right, but I think there's also probably an aspect of miracle within it as well. I think there's an aspect of God put it there and we don't understand. Nobody knew some of it.
I mean, it's possible. I mean, it's just that there seems to be.
The thing that makes me convinced of that more than anything is the number codes in Torah.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they could not have possibly been discovered prior to computers. That you cannot possibly conceivably find those codes without a computer. There's no way somebody could have written them in. So I think the same is probably true here. Is that I think that there was some of them understanding a level of beyond what the masses did, but I think there's probably also a thing that this was written by God Himself.
There are times when people accidentally get things right in the scriptures, like where, you know, they're speaking. Herod gave an inspired speech, for example, but then he didn't give Yeshua credit. He didn't give God credit for it, you know, and so that he died, right? There were times when Caiaphas, the high priest,
Something else that's interesting, really, is to talk about the person who found the treasure in the field.
Caiaphas, the supposed high priest.
He sold everything he had and bought that field for a greater treasure. And that's what happens in this, right? So this person becomes wealthy to rule, but then he renounces everything, I guess, in order to gain the kingdom.
Well, yeah, it's just an overthrow of the established order, though. It's telling you that age is over with, and then there's a new time coming. And again, where we will be kings, right? Let him become king, right? And priests, right? And we will rule in the millennium, right? Under his power and his authority, right? And so then it kind of flows into the next one. He who is near me is near the fire, and he who is far from me is far from the kingdom, right? So fire and kingdom, because of the parallelism here, they're related terms. And fire is one of those things that's like mountains, that they can have it could be a mountain could be God's kingdom, or a mountain could be man's kingdom, because what it refers to is basically it's founded upon the earth, because the mountain is made out of earth, and then it's a high place. So in other words, in the case of men and their mountains, it has to do with their kingdoms. The high mountains will be shaken, and the mountains will be shaken. The high hills will be made low. That has to do with the hierarchy of things that are built upon the earth, or the earthly teachings, right? But then there's the mountain of God, the Mount Zion, all that. You know what I'm saying? It has two aspects. Waves are like that too, because waves on the sea are like mountains, if you will, of water, right? So they represent high places, and that's why you see that these men are wild waves of the sea, right? It makes a certain logical sense, because waves are water that's basically higher up, and that waves that things below or whatever are like the subjects, if you will, or the people that are subject to the waves or subject to the mountains. But that being said, the fire, okay, the fire is like that because fire, again, in James it talks about this, the tongue is set on by the fires of hell. It's a small member, but it's set up by, or it's what's the verse? It's
Yes, that's kind of interesting how sometimes, like take the metaphor of leaven, right? Most of the time, leaven represents sin.
Right, but not always.
But sometimes Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, a little leaven. A little leaven can leaven a whole lump, but a little bit can make something big. It's like the mustard seed, right?
Right.
So 9 times out of 10, leaven's a symbol for iniquity, but not always. It could be a symbol of fruitfulness and prosperity, starting with little and God's kingdom doing great things. So a fire, it could be destructive, right? It could burn down a forest, but then it can give us warmth and light. So it just depends. Or like the lion, right? Jesus is the lion of the tribe of Judah, but then the devil is like a lion seeking who may devour. So you have to look at the context
it's all based
of
on
the parable to
Right,
understand it,
shall we call
to crack the meaning
And
of
just,
it,
just
right?
Fire
like
down
the
from
priest
heaven.
and king, right? Some people see it as our ruling power, but in actuality, that's the one who all the responsibility falls on. That's why when the people
Right.
sinned, it was the priest who took. So when you assume that role, it's like truth and revelation and understanding to be close to the kingdom is to be close to fire, because you're always understanding and correcting.
Yeah, and fire has to do with trials too. Don't be surprised at the fiery trials that
Right.
surround you.
Or
Fire's
refining,
not bad.
right? You take the gold, it's got the dross in it, you refine it to get it pure. And that's what the Lord does to us when He puts us through trials and tribulations.
To expound on what he was saying about priest and king, the king was supposed to be the one who was first in the battle. The story of David and Goliath, the stark, unspoken part of that story is that the obvious person who should have stood up against Goliath was Saul.
Right?
He was head and shoulders above everyone else, trained
Right.
soldier.
Right.
He was supposed to be leading the army. He was the one who should have been up there saying, Goliath, you back down.
Right.
He didn't do it. That was the job of the king, was to be the first. The priest stood in the gap. That's why Aaron was told, don't mourn for your sons lest the whole people die. You're in a position here. To be a priest and a king is right at the cusp. That is,
Yep. Right on the line of the fire. and the
That's
Right on the
that's
top.
an example about King David. Of course, maybe he should have been out leading his troops in battle. Instead, he was sleeping with soldiers' wives. But
Yeah.
there was a time, however, with David, like you're saying, Saul wouldn't fight, but David did, and he's in this battle. He almost got killed. I guess he's older and his prowess
Look,
as a
that's
soldier.
enough.
Yeah, it's okay. We don't want you fighting anymore. But until that point, until David wasn't physically able to fight,
He did.
He was fighting, unlike Saul, who stayed in the
Well,
back.
it's like they say, it's not the size of the dog in the fight; it's the size of the fight in the dog, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing, right?
It
He
also
was the last and the least. He was the youngest, the smallest, or whatever. And actually one of the powerful songs, I think it's 151, talks about that too. Is taken from
Right. One thing about it's kind of interesting is in the Aramaic, the Syriac Bible, there's 155 psalms. So the question is where do these extra psalms come from? So they make them up and add them, Why does why does the Aramaic Bible have 5 additional psalms? And when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found that these 5 extra psalms were among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yep.
So it wasn't something that Aramaic Christians just made up and stuck in there.
Something else everyone
It was
else
something
lost.
that goes back
Yeah.
to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, it's ancient Jewish writings, the scripture as it was at the time of Yeshua.
But anyway, but fire is associated with a lot of things. It has to do with purification. It has to do with the fire of the Spirit, so to speak. Our God is a consuming fire. It has a lot to do with you're either burnt up or you're refined, right? The fiery trials which are designed to test you, right? So you're going through a trial when Yeshua, his feet were as burning brass as though they had been refined by a fire. Those kinds of things. So it's like, they say it'll cure you or to kill you, you know what I'm saying? It'll burn you up. What does Paul say? That your chaff will be burned up or burned up like chaff, or else you'll be refined by it. But then he goes on, okay, so the images are manifest to man, but the light in them remains concealed in the image of the light of the Father. He will become manifest, but his image will remain concealed by his light. Well, number one, this has already happened. Whenever all of the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Yeshua, were concealed in images. And Hebrew talks about this too, the shadows of things to come, right? That these images and these shadows are basically like terms. They're basically talking about the same thing. That which is to be revealed, basically by definition, of course, and common sense would tell you if it's to be revealed, it's because it's concealed, or it's because it hasn't yet been made known, right? And so the images, like what I was talking about, the transfiguration, for example, the symbolism that you can suss out of that, right? That it remains latent within it in order to be understood at some later time on a higher level. Now that higher level is the light that exists within these things, right? So when he says that the images are manifest to man, in other words, they see the fleshly level of things, they see the surface level of things, right? But the light within them, right? Just as when Yeshua came, all of the Old Testament scriptures sort of lit up, in terms of their meaning, right?
Right.
So that was a function of the fulfillment, right? And the understanding of the significance of that fulfillment. Was it not written this? Do you not read this, right? All of this stuff, because again, it's to be understood in a higher level, in a new light, in other words, right? So in other words, if there's going to be subsequent revelation, it is because this imagery conceals underneath the facade of fleshly terminology a heavenly light that you can understand in your heart with your eye, see with your eyes and hear with your ears on a spiritual level. So again, he will become manifest, right? In other words, you'll see it, but his image will remain concealed by his light. So in other words, he's very carefully made it look this way in order that it can come to light at some point in the future. And then he goes and develops this further in the next legend, 84, where it says, when you see your likeness, you rejoice. But when you see your images which came into being before you, and which neither die nor become manifest, how much you will have to bear. So what are the images that pertain to the church? What are the teachings that pertain to the church, right? Well, for example, the vine of the earth in Revelation, for example, right? Of the earth, right?
The what?
The vine of the earth, right? That the grapes or whatever are going to be thrown into the great winepress and trampled down, right? Because it speaks of that's congruous to the grapevine that has been planted outside of the Father, right? That's the vine of the earth, right? Yeshua says, "I am the true vine," implying there's a false vine. You see what I'm saying? So there you have another dual meaning, right? But when you see the images that came before you, right, and which neither die nor become manifest. In other words, if the heavenly is couched in the earthly, right, it's not dead because it's there latent within it, right? But it has not yet been made manifest either, right? Because it's still in its latency, right? But when it does become manifest, how much you will have to bear. Why? Because it means that they testify against you. You see that Peter, I'm calling you the church, right? But then Peter's kind of got that in his head that he's the favorite somehow, right? But then Yeshua rebukes him so many times, right? I hate to pick on Peter, but there's a lot of times where he's a hothead and he lets his pride get to him and stuff like that. Well, I mean, there's a fine line there between his denial and Judas's betrayal, and I think that's where the lines are drawn. Denial is sort of out of ignorance; he didn't even know what he was doing until it happened, right? Whereas betrayal is like, hey, let me tell you where he's at, give you some money, right? You know, a little bit different from that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I
so-
think that's where the lines are drawn.
Peter had
Between
this-
what's forgivable and what's
This
not.
false bravado, I'm going to go in there and I'll be this great hero. But when time came, he got scared, right? While Judas Iscariot's like, I'm going to get him arrested.
Yeah. But again, because it testifies against the church and really the religious establishment as a whole, right? And again, that bears on let him who has grown rich become king and let him who has power renounce it, right? Because again, that's part of the overthrow. Look, you had your chance, you had all this time, you didn't figure this out, or worse, if you did, you somehow suppressed it, right? So which is it, right? But again, the way he uses this particular language belies that particular teaching. Again, when you see your likeness, in other words, that which is spoken of you, you rejoice, right? Like the way that the Catholic Church, for example, sees itself in Peter, right?
Yeah.
I am the, I speak from the, as if I were Peter,
Yes.
right?
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Yes.
So they see that and they're like, yeah, I rejoice at that, right? But when you see your images that came into being before you, in other words, the things that are prophesied of you and couched in earthly terminology, right? And they neither die nor become manifest because again, they're held back until the time of the end. How much you will have to bear, that's a future thing. So when you come to realize that the scriptures testify against you, and I'm going to ask you to renounce your power in favor of people who have come to find the treasure and become wealthy by it, right? That's what you're going to have to bear, right? In the same way that Peter was angry that John was going to follow him,
Right.
right? Do you not love me more than these others, right? And Peter was angry, right? And then he says, well, when you were young, you dressed yourself, right? When you're old, somebody else is going to dress you and take you where you did not want to go, right? In other words, they didn't want to go to Enoch. They didn't want to go to Thomas. They didn't want to go to any of this stuff, right? So that's with reference to the church, right? So it's pretty manifest, and it's also in the canonical, right? So that's another reason why you can trust Thomas in a way, because if you understand the insights here, they carry over into the canonicals, and then you see all of these murky sayings that don't make a whole lot of sense on the level of the flesh. All of a sudden, you see the light within them, and they come alive for you, right? And so what is that great, and then he goes on, he says, well, Adam came into being from a great power and a great wealth, right? Talking about the wealth again, right? But he did not become worthy of you, because if he had been worthy, he would not have experienced death. And what is death? Death is the ignorance, right?
Of course, that's
Whoever
also-
comes to understand the meaning of these words will not taste of death.
Let's also connect to the story of the fall of man, right?
Definitely.
Adam's in the garden. Potentially, he's going to live forever in perfect communion with God. But he decides to disobey God, break the commandment, eat the forbidden fruit, and then he's cut off from the sources of mortality, and death is pronounced upon him. He dies after a very long life, but dies nevertheless.
Well, I mean,
he wouldn't have otherwise.
I mean, if I gave you a donut and I said this was the donut of life and death, the donut of good and evil. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
The fact is, you're putting something into your mouth, so to speak. You're consuming something, in other words, that has evil in it, right? And so a person who is worthy would not taste of that death, in other words. They would not eat that evil thing because it's labeled evil. It's a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, drink me, eat me, you know what I'm saying?
Like Snow White.
Why would you do that?
Like Snow White, right?
Well, because he came from a great power and a great wealth. Well, what is the wealth? The understanding. So he exchanged that understanding, in other words, for something that was literally labeled evil. Good and evil, right? Of course, he blamed his wife for that, but I mean, that being said, he did it regardless,
It's interesting how Paul doesn't hold Eve responsible. The way Paul is, Adam alone is responsible. And then Paul even says, well, she was deceived. He willfully sinned.
Well, and again, that bears on
that's right.
the judgment here. Because it wasn't like he was deceived, right? He had that great wealth, it says, right? He understood. I mean, he wasn't obviously stupid. He had power over the animals in the earth and how to tend the garden and everything. He wasn't
And he
dumb.
just instructed Eve until you would die from touching it. Right.
But I mean, just as an aside, if how many people would defend their wives and their children or whatever, even if they knew they were wrong?
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? Maybe
That's-
you
that's
would,
instinct.
just
That's
as a
you-
human
that's just
thing,
instinct.
you got to go home with them, right? I mean, after all,
You might
It
not
is
like
what
him
it is.
yourself, right?
And then maybe he felt something when God said it wasn't good for man to be alone. And then he thought, okay, this is what's going to leave me alone. And he forgot that regardless of whatever happened to her, that God would be there for him.
He makes provision.
That he
for
wouldn't be,
Adam.
but perhaps he felt like he would be alone if he didn't go where she went.
I mean, in the Descensus, you see that Adam was basically one of the first ones rescued out of Hades. You know, that the provision was made for him. You know, but it would not come without a price.
Right.
And that would be that evil would play itself out. And if you look at the world, and again, I kind of harp on this a little bit, but I'm old enough to remember a time when the idea was that truth was objective. I mean, even, you know, forget biblical truth, whatever. Just truth itself
Right.
was a respected concept. You know, whether you achieved it or not, a little beside the
Or that
point.
it even
You had to
existed,
make,
or that
if
it
you made
even
a point,
existed.
you had to defend that point. If you made an assertion, you had to defend that assertion, right? If we move from a truth-based, evidence-based, you know, trial and error, you know, whatever, an actual, where there's some basis of truth in it, no matter what it is, right? Into a consensus reality, where 1 and 1 is 3 because we say it's 3. And if you say
My
it's
truth,
2, then
my
you're an
truth.
extremist, right?
Right.
Because again, in the land of the naked, the clothed man, you know.
And the blind, right?
Exactly. So
There's
sorry.
A saying that I really like. If you understand, things are exactly as they are.
Mhm.
If you don't understand, things are exactly as they are.
Yeah.
Right. Tucker Carlson, of course, he did 2 presentations that led to him getting fired, I guess. Well, 3 things. Number 1, apparently.
J6.
Well, no, that's cumulative, but they're going to get rid of him for that and other things. But apparently, the straw that broke the camel's back was him talking about God and faith and the power of prayer. He gave a presentation at the Heritage Foundation, and then he gave a podcast around the same time. And one of the things he was saying is like, where we're at right now. He says you can't collect facts and come up with compelling arguments and explanations because these people don't accept facts as being true. Right? They don't
Right.
even, no, now they don't even accept biology.
My truth.
Right, and Victor Davis Hanson was saying the same thing. I mean, it doesn't matter how much facts you have on your side. These people, they're relativists. They don't believe in facts or truth. They just believe in their little fantasy world they created for themselves.
Except they believe their truth is the truth.
No amount of-
Their truth is unchallengeable. All truth is unchallengeable except their truth.
It doesn't. What do you say? It
Right,
doesn't matter how
right,
many
right.
facts you put together. And Tucker Carlson. I've been trying to do this, especially when I was younger. Just I'll collect all the facts, all the data, and present the evidence, compelling
Good
arguments. And they don't care about that. They don't care about the facts or evidence or any of that. So what do?
With the woman who cut off the engagement with Murdoch was a Christian, and that was
Right.
one of the reasons. And that
Yeah.
and Murdoch might be taking that out on to some
This guy's
extent.
like a 90-something year old man.
That's why I've been opposed for years to such things as when talking about Christmas or Easter, and people say, but that's not what it means to me.
Right.
I could give a flip what it means to you. What does it mean to God? Truth is still true.
Right.
And this as to what do you do goes back to, and I've shared this several times before, my mom's favorite saying: a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still.
Right.
There comes a point where, that's what the unpardonable sin is. The unpardonable sin is when you have come to the point where you will not be moved by spirit.
Right.
And you will not accept truth because you just don't want it.
Right.
An inconvenient truth.
Yeah, inconvenient truth, exactly.
And then you get
What do
there
you-
at that point
what-
where God just has to give them over to a reprobate mind because there's nothing he can do.
Well, I
to-
mean, we see that.
And-
We
and
see
if-
that
and if-
abroad in the land now.
And if God gives them over to a reprobate mind,
Well,
what can I do?
the constant refrain in the antediluvian age was they did things that were right in their own sight, and then
Yes.
after that, there's this constant railing of they did what was right in their own eyes.
Because that's
Right.
that's the book of Judges.
Because that's subjective versus objective. right? That's
Nothing new under the sun. We think that this is a new concept, but
Well,
it's
and
not.
also, yeah, I mean, the constant refrain is, and as in the days of Noah, so shall it
That's
be
right.
at the end, right? Which, I don't know how deeply you can read into it. I mean, why would everything on the earth have to be destroyed? I mean, is it possible that it was a technical civilization? I mean, there's a lot of curious possibilities. Is it possible they had artificial intelligence? Is it possible that they lived in a world that literally had to be buried and destroyed and completely removed from the surface of the earth so that nobody could get hold of that knowledge, nobody would know that it existed, nobody could retain it,
I'm wondering if it wasn't to save other parts of the universe. Perhaps they were getting to a point where they could travel and they would carry the
and
evil
they
to other places,
were
and he had
getting
to
to that-
protect the rest of his creation.
They were getting to that
Yeah,
point in
so
Babylon too, where they
steroids.
said that because they all spoke the same language, because they all were of one mind and one will together with one another, that they had to be separated. And so
Yeah, if you took a technology right now, if you took, I'll use myself as an example. You took me, okay, and destroyed all of the world except me and my family. What are the chances I would be able to make a computer? I couldn't. There's
Right.
no way. I don't understand. I couldn't make a power plant. I couldn't do it. I don't have the technical knowledge.
you might also see the need not to do that.
Right.
You
right,
might also see the need to, if you knew something, not say something.
Right.
Right? And
So-
people talk about that with God. That was an atheist. That was one of my biggest problems with God was like, well, why, if he had all this knowledge, why couldn't he just have given us all of this knowledge, right?
Yes.
As a person not realizing that
Yes.
that technology is a weapon and
Yes.
if there were other
Two-edged
worlds,
sword.
and I mean, I don't know, but if there were other worlds, my thoughts are that they would roughly go through the same processes that we go through here, and that they might just destroy themselves the same way. They might be just as depraved as we are. So again, and that's purely hypothetical. I don't know, but that being said, it stands to reason that they would if they did.
These people are so evil. Tucker was interviewing Elon Musk, and Elon Musk said, I guess when he's in his 20s, he's talking to this younger man, and it's like, he goes, I'm going to invent a god. So I'm going to invent an artificial intelligence that's going to destroy, take over the world. And Elon Musk is like, well, what about humanity? What about mankind? Oh, you're a speciesist. You have a devotion to the human species. And then Elon Musk says, okay, well, that's what you want to call it. I'm guilty as charged. I'm
Right.
concerned about the welfare. So these guys, they're so wicked and evil. They're literally trying to come up with, a Terminator type scenario where they invent Skynet that, and Elon Musk is like, he thinks they're on the verge of doing it. He's very disturbed about
To
it.
eliminate this contagion called humanity and physical life.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
I,
I mean, that's the
I heard
level of
someone say a
wicked-
quote that said, if you want to know what really, where society's really headed, you just have to look at entertainment in the movies, because Hollywood will tell on itself.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're
Exactly where
There's
it's
a
going.
certain
they're
power
responsible.
to spell
They're responsible
casting.
for a lot of this stuff. They've messaged this stuff. They've laden this stuff in there. They've been brainwashing us for decades.
Well,
Oh, sure.
And I mean, and even back 60 years ago in grade school, they were starting to bring in the political with pollution and
Or like,
apartheid.
you-
And what does a sixth grader know about any of that?
One of the things is, was it DDT?
Yeah.
When I was in school, it's like,
Silent Spring.
DDT is, and then Mark Levin is saying, DDT could save millions of lives around the world. And in Africa, by not having DDT, people are getting malaria and are dying.
Yes, yes.
And it can be used in a way that doesn't harm the
It
environment.
never did. It was a fake argument,
Yeah.
just like global warming.
Or like right now, in a lot of places around the world, what's going to happen, is like the Japanese people have a huge population explosion. We do in this country as well. If it wasn't for immigration. Europe, so you got zero population. A lot of countries have zero population growth, and you got 20, 30, 40% population decline in certain places, like in Europe. And in Japan, where they're on the verge to go extinct within a few centuries. The whole, all the Japanese are gonna, they're not replacing. They're going extinct slowly.
Goes down far enough, it'll go back.
But in
up,
schools, they're still, even though that's not true, they're still teaching people the population bomb.
Yeah.
They're teaching our kids that right now. So there's these things that they know aren't true, and yet they're teaching like DDT and Silent Spring and all that, and the population explosion.
Well-
Things that aren't true that are being taught in our schools to our kids.
Well,
And
just
then
like,
we got what's the name? Ernest
Population-
Bales trying
just like
to.
taking away the
Population
guns will
explosion would be true
will
because
save
of
us.
true-
We'll-
Right.
they get- they'll do exactly
These
the
are all,
opposite.
these are all means of seizing
Control.
power.
Right.
Yeah, that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
The just like, okay, if you could bring that all back in, rein it in a little bit, bring it all back to the idea of control versus freedom, right? The idea is that you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So the corollary to that, if you're the devil and you're listening to that, you're saying, oh, well, to enslave people, you need to hide the truth from them,
That's right.
right? You're inverting,
And he knows that.
right? So he can take all of these concepts and invert them and create a roadmap of his own based
That's right.
on the inversion. The idea is that you want to suppress
Great job.
information.
That's exactly
You want to make it so that if somebody shows you video evidence, well, you know, that's
A
evil, that's misleading, you know, and I
Out of
guess I
context.
come from a
Or
generation where it was
computer-generated.
unthinkable to me that somebody would literally look at raw data, raw information, and say, oh, well, it's, you know, erroneous, it's deceptive, it's, you know what I'm saying? And then listen to people just spout
Like-
out propaganda and
Like-
say that that's reliable.
The big
And
lie.
somebody goes
Like-
against that as the
the big
extreme.
Like Jeff was saying earlier today, I was at January 6th all day long, and I didn't see any violence. And I was actually standing outside the Capitol, and all that. Those FBI agents were executing their whatever their operation they were doing. So Tucker has access to this video just to show people what really happened, and they flip out. And then we have
And
the-
something happened that didn't let him show the
Well,
second night. too.
Right.
Because-
Tucker, Murdoch shut it down after one night, and Schumer's out there. Oh, you better not show this video. You better not do it. And it's
Basically
like,
calling for Tucker to be fired, as was AOC.
and then what was the other thing?
But-
Well, Roy Epps, real quick. You know, you got a grandma who's been in solitary confinement because she walked in there and took a picture, or the QAnon shaman. What did he do? He was escorted in there.
But as soon as they found the footage, he's released.
Yeah, so he didn't do anything wrong. It's all on video, and yet.
it didn't turn over the
60
discovery.
Minutes did a protection thing. I'm watching this. I recommend you watching it. You realize it's like this guy's he's not a Trump supporter. He's never has been. If he was, he would have been in prison for what he did, for one thing. And number two, just the way he talks. So you have this, why are they protecting Roy Epps? Because he's the smoking gun, or one of them.
It has to do with personality
And the pipe
types.
bombs.
It has to do with personality types. Now, I understand that a person can change. As a former atheist, I can tell you that the reason I didn't believe in the Bible is because it all seemed like fairy tales, and anybody could say anything, anybody could believe anything, and in fact, they do.
Wasn't
You
some
go
of
this
it the
part of the
behavior-
world, they believe
wasn't
this.
some of
You
it the
go to that
behavior of
part of the world, you
Christians?
believe that.
Wasn't some of that influenced by
Well,
the
but
behavior of
again,
Christians?
Yes.
the devil is able to take advantage of this tendency in men to believe in authorities and to believe in authoritative sources and to believe in scholarship in order to sell you the lower level understanding,
Traditions of
in order to hide that treasure in the dirt of the
Right.
earth, so to speak,
Right.
by covering it up.
You're
And
touching
because
on my sermon
because
next week.
the Bible is written in a sort of ambiguous term, because the heavenly treasures are couched in earthen vessels, right? That's what the Bible says. It says these things a whole 100 different ways, but that which is heavenly is couched in the earthly. Well, because there's going to be a time when the earthly ideas will prevail, right? And the heavenly ideas basically come out of those ideas. Again, he says come out of her, come out of the church, in other words, come out of Babylon. It's all one thing. The same forces that tell you can't believe your eyes with video are the same people who at the beginning were saying you can't believe your eyes when it says, Jude says that this is ancient, prophetic, whatever. We say otherwise. We're the authority. If you go against us, we're going to come against you. It's easy to see that set up in the early church because it's the same basic mechanism. The suppression of truth, the suppression of information, the ability to take people's ability to see and hear directly away from them and interpose oneself between that person and the truth to get rid of books that that they would otherwise read and insights that they would otherwise get. It's the same sort of suppression of information. When you see suppression of information, it's because the devil has his hand in it.
We covered the news.
I think it's important to understand the willfulness.
Yeah.
Because if we're given a little truth, that's why we're talking about the mustard seed.
Right.
If we're given a little truth, it will do the same things that you're referring to. Seeing the truth will lift you up.
Right.
The little bit of truth will lift you up.
Right.
Those who don't want truth are even rejecting the little bits of truth that they're given.
Or
It's
like
willful.
you're saying, you mentioned this in previous lessons, how that it is willful. Like Brother John McTurnan was saying, how he perplexed and defeated Tobias Singer, and the guy goes, Jesus is the Messiah, right? And yet, he knows
The stones cry out.
he knows it's true, but he still opposes it and blasphemes and mocks. And like you're saying, he had Stephen there. Like you're saying, maybe this was really going on. Stephen was being transfigured.
Yeah.
He was going through like this, what we're going to do, I guess, in the resurrection.
Yes.
And yet when they saw him, they heard him speak the truth. They knew it was true, quoted from the scriptures, and they see him as a
Glowing.
transfiguration, becoming like an angel, and he's seeing into heaven. He sees this Yeshua as the Son of Man, which is how the Messiah is described in Daniel, in the book of Enoch. What do they try to do? They try to gnash their teeth on him, maybe grinding their teeth or even biting him.
Yep.
Yeah, and the thing
And
we
they
need,
kill him.
the thing we need to realize, Stephen, from the very example you just gave, is that Paul was in that crowd.
Yeah, touch
You know,
Paul.
so I mean, it didn't.
See,
But that's just it. It didn't.
He may have been at the front.
It wasn't until later that Paul came around.
Right,
Even
right.
those
At that time.
we think are
Right.
lost and are of the opposition
Oh, sure.
are not beyond God, and that's why
Right.
we're not the judge.
Right.
Right. Yeah, but we're just be cognizant of this fact that they can enter in such an evil
Well,
state.
great
like you're
sinners
talking
become
about earlier.
great saints.
There's
The
a-
reprobate
yeah.
mind.
There's a
but
per-
Paul was obviously, as bad as he wasn't in the reprobate mind. Yet he never fell into reprobate mind because Yeshua appeared to him and saved him and made him the greatest apostle.
Well, what we know about Paul, what Yeshua said about him, is he asked him rhetorically, why you kick against the pricks? I mean, in other words, why do you do what you know is wrong? Even though it pains you to do it, why are you doing it? Right? As if to say that it was a willful.
You know better.
It was a willful
You're-
act.
You're
you know
saying
you're
this,
hurting
you don't want to let
yourself,
go.
but
But that being said, again, there's a certain personality type that rejects truth even in the full light of knowledge. And it says in the book of
And
Revelation,
really, we're all like that a little bit.
but it says in the book of Revelation, outside of the city, right? Again, the city of Jerusalem. There's New Jerusalem. The Jerusalem. Paul talks about the Jerusalem that is above and the Jerusalem that is below, right? And he talks, and the Jerusalem that is above is spoken of by John in the book of Revelation as descending from heaven down to the earth, as if to say it's taking over, it's supplanting, it's replacing. Again, because the heavenly is coming down and replacing the earthly, right? And that's the city that can only be accessed by means of truth. You go in through the entrances of the patriarchs because they were first, right? Lay it upon the foundation of the apostles because they were next, right? And then there's the vertical aspect, which is the walls. That's the third revelation. That's why there are 144 cubits. That's related to the 144,000, right? Has to do with the elect, right? And one is just as, just as important as his length and width and the height. And Paul even says the depth, right? The idea is that has to do with one is just as important as the other. The first revelation, the second revelation, the third revelation are co-equal. And that's the city of God that is you gain entrance to it by means of truth because you are excluded from it by means of loving and making a lie. Right? And so, in other words, you have to love the truth and make the truth in order to counter those who love and make a lie. Right? And there are people who love that lie and they make that lie. And that lie is a creation. That lie is forced. That lie is willful. The lie is blatant. And the lie is basically on shaky ground. It's not built on the foundation of anything. Right? That's why the axe is laid at the roots of the trees. That's why the grapevine is going to be pulled out by the roots. You know what I'm saying? Those two things are undermined by the truth, and the entire Jerusalem that is below will crumble under the truth that descends from the heavens.
All right. Well, we gotta close up. So, yes, and of course, Marx. It's like it's a total lie. Millions of people died through this lie.
But they love it, and therefore they make it.
Yeah.
and we see it, the totalitarian Marxist, wicked, evil. What's the appeal of it? It's foolish.
Well, they don't believe in the
Face.
heaven to come, so they want their way on earth, and they'll force it. They're not gonna be patient to wait for the life to come,
Right.
because they either don't believe it or they don't care for it.
Right.
Right, it's true.
And it says that they have to save the planet themselves.
Brother Z, could you close us out in a word of prayer, and then we'll enter into our worship service?
Yahweh, we thank you today for all that you have done in our life, and thank you for what you're getting ready to do. We thank you for even the battles that we face, that you shall strengthen us and guide us in every area of our life, and we'll become more like you each and every day. We give you praise right now for as we link together with everybody in this room and those watching. We know that you shall come through for us by faith, and we'll receive you by your Holy Spirit. We love you. Amen.
Amen.